And today we have the Ozone Photon ENC2 liner. Exciting! So first impressions of the Ozone Photon, a few hours including the ground handling, playing around. So based on my experience today, first of all on the ground, so with those very small cells with a pronounced shark nose, I found that the glider just takes a little bit more to get inflated than, say for example, the Bonanza 3, which I found really easy to inflate and build a wall with. And the Photon was just required more finesse and was less forgiving in that way. Totally fine for the class, but not as easy as the Bonanza 3, for example. I found the Artik R slightly easier to build the wall as well and get it inflated. But once you got the air and inflate it, then the glider came up really nicely. I was pleased to see that actually it wants to come up even from near the ground, so it's not like some other two liners and some other Ozone gliders that I've flown that have a tendency to kind of hang back on the ground and require like a pull to get them up past that first kind of quarter to a third to get them up and fly. Got a tendency to come up more from the tips than the middle, so you've got to watch that if you let it go. So that was just something I found, is that you tended to need to hold the glider down a bit actually once it had taken its shape in the breeze. So a bit more so than I found with the Bonanza 3 or the Volt 4, which is surprising because the Volt 4 was quite lightweight. So that was my experience today, but it's quite important, I found, to step towards the wing, otherwise the glider can build up a lot of speed and want to come up fast and need quite heavy brakes to stop it, and could pluck you. Again, obviously for the level of pilot that's flying that glider, they should be totally fine with that, but a little bit more demanding. The one that keeps standing out to me is the Bonanza 3, but that is probably the least demanding. Quite similar to the Artik R, which I also found on the ground required a bit more finesse and a bit more precision and was a bit less forgiving than those other two ENC2 liners and than most C-class gliders. I'd say there, comparing it to the Delta 4, the Photon is, yeah, I found it reasonably more demanding on the ground in that way. And in fact just managing it on the ground and the launch, it requires a bit more precision and a bit more finesse and is a bit less forgiving than the Alpina 4 or the Delta 4. Testing the stall on the ground, playing around ground handling and being a bit heavy-handed on the brakes, purposely to see how resistant it is to stalling and how predictable the stall point is. And actually I'm impressed with that. I think it's very good. The stall point I found more obvious, easier to feel and to control than, say, the Volt 4, and possibly, this needs to be checked, but possibly a little easier than the Artik R, but probably quite similar. I think on the ground the Artik R and the Photon seem quite similar. The Bonanza 3 is significantly easier to do that. Quite pleased with that on the Photon. I could feel quite clearly before the glider stalled. Also of note, once I stalled the glider and let it drop back a bit into a stall, when I put my hands up, the glider had a tendency to come back up and fly and I could catch it again. Whereas for example on the Volt 4, if I did the same thing, then the glider would kind of stall and drop right back and be not quite as easy to manage. In the air, a bit of a different story. So compared to the other ENC2 liners I've flown, the Volt 4, the Artik R and the Bonanza 3, I'd say that in the air the Photon moves around more. It moves more as two wings. That's what I was finding. I was flying with my Lightness 3, which I have flown some of the other gliders with as well. The Bonanza 3 I did fly with the Impress 4, which does feel more stable than the Lightness, does have a bit more movement, but I'm very used to my Lightness, and today the conditions are quite benign. But I did notice that the Photons kind of moves around as two wings more, and so it had a feeling that was a bit more of a higher performance glider. It had more of a sort of slightly a D-class kind of feeling to me, but that's just that's how it felt. That's how it felt in its movements and how it sort of talked and moved around. And because of that, I found it a bit less comfortable than the Bonanza 3, quite noticeably actually. Despite the conditions being, the turbulence levels are certainly no more today. A bit more wind, but less kind of less of an inversion, less wind shear, just more of a sort of laminar wind really. And yeah, I found that the Photon definitely moves around more, and I think it takes a bit more getting used to. So for me, I prefer a glider that doesn't move around like that as much. And I think that, to be honest, is because it just feels more comfortable to have a glider that feels more monoblock, as the whole wing moving together rather than the two sides moving a little bit independently. So I mean, I don't want to overstate that, it's just there's a little bit of a feeling of that compared to the other ENC 2-liners, which felt more solid and more uni-block. In terms of handling, I found the brake pressure is moderate to slightly on the firmer side. In terms of agility, is moderate to slightly on the steady side. So compared to the Bonanza 3 I was flying yesterday, or the Artik R, which I feel like are a bit more agile and a bit more nimble. Probably more similar to the Volt 4, which I found again a bit steady in its turns. It's kind of, yeah, you can make it turn and it turns fine, but it has a tendency to turn kind of more flat. Another thing that surprised me with the Photon is the brakes are really quite long. So if you don't have just holding the brake toggles, they're quite low, like down here. So you definitely take a wrap with them, obviously, which you do with all of these wings. However, even then the brake travel was a little bit on the long side, and the actual travel required, I found, to work some of the thermals I was working today, which were smallish, they weren't big, so I was having to really pull the brakes down quite a bit and use quite a bit of weight shift to get the glider to come round. Whereas I found the Bonanza 3 was actually easier to turn, and I could turn tighter with it, despite flying that with a more stable harness, the Empress 4. Today, flying the Lightness 3, I would expect the other way round, to be honest. So yeah, so good agility and good handling, but seems more tuned on to me felt more tuned to the kind of efficient flat turning and stable and efficient, rather than agile and dynamic. It could be a little bit the conditions today. It was sort of a bit breezy and the air was a bit not as nice as yesterday, so that could explain it a little bit, but that's the feeling I have. Interestingly, doing some wing overs, I could quickly build up energy with the glider. It really keeps its energy nicely, so I could very quickly build up. I didn't do particularly big wing overs today. I didn't have a lot of height and didn't do any particularly big wing overs, so I just played around a bit, and you could quickly build up energy. And because the glider feels really solid and very efficient, it can really carve around and do some very nice wing overs, so it was great for that. But in terms of like thermaling and working little bitty cores and stuff like that, it's a little bit more on the steady side. In terms of performance, well, what I saw today, the Photon goes very, very well. Yeah, it's definitely going to be up at the top. It's definitely going to be at least one of the top of the ENC 2-liners, and it's certainly right up at the top. I'll need to do some more testing about it, but in terms of where it really stood out to me was glide. It's got a very good glide, very efficient, really punches upwind nicely. On the speed bar, it really picks up good speed. I didn't actually properly measure it, sorry, I'll do that another time, but even on half bar it was picking up more than 10 k's an hour already, and on full bar I didn't measure it, and I didn't have it on all that long, to be honest, because the air was a bit funky, but it seemed like it picked up a good amount more speed. So the performance feels really right up there and very efficient, good speed. This is a glider that's made for performance and speed. As an example, sticking within the Ozone range, I'd say that at trim the performance has got to be at least as good as the Mantra M7, which is a low D, and so that's an idea, and I think the performance is good as that. And then accelerated, my feeling is that the Photon is noticeably goes faster and is more efficient, as you'd expect from a 2-liner, but considering the Photon's a high C and the Mantra's a low D, but that's because folding lines weren't allowed then. In terms of the climb rate, I think it's really good. It's got a very good climb rate. My feeling so far of the ENC 2-liners is that the two best ones so far, this is my feeling, first impressions, are the Bonanza 3 and the Artik R. So they seem to favour on the sink rate and the climb rate, and The Artik R was very quick, felt like possibly the fastest. On full bar it had my attention, it was very, very quick. And the Photon could be potentially as quick, but I got to test it out. But the Photon kind of moves around more, whereas the Artik R is more solid on accelerated, and the Bonanza even more so. It's very, very solid accelerated. But the Bonanza doesn't feel as quick at top speed so far. At top speed I was very comfortable using the speed bar on the Bonanza. I could just use it very, very happily, and even punching through some chop. That was not the case with the Photon. I felt more like kind of backing off a bit on the speed bar and working the rear risers more. The glider felt less solid than the Bonanza 3 does, but as I say, I think that's a lot of that could be just how the glider moves about, and you just get used to that. But still, you know, it's a less comfortable feeling. So overall, on my first impressions of the Ozone Photon, I am really, really impressed with it. I think it's a really great glider, very, very impressive, as I think all of these new ENC liners that have come out are. But they've got a very different character, so each of them has a different character. They're different on the ground, they're different in the air, the handling is different, they've got different strengths and weaknesses in their performance, so they're definitely not all the same by any means. I think they're actually pretty different, and but all great gliders in their own right. And really it's going to be down to personal preference, which is the right glider for you, which is what's most important for you, whether it's the out and out performance, or it's the pilot demands, or the climb rate, the sink rate, the handling, or just the pleasure of the glider, feedback, and they're all quite different for that way.